General Hospital spoilers reveal that under the heavy shadow of recent betrayals and calculated deception, Sonny found himself navigating a rapidly evolving battlefield that no longer revolved solely around territory or criminal alliances but now bled into the deeply personal, his fractured relationship with Michael and the threat looming over his family. For months, Sonny had been kept at arm's length, a distance enforced by Michael's own disillusionment after years of pain, disappointment, and manipulation. However, despite the icy distance, Sonny never stopped keeping an eye on his son, especially now that Sasha, the mother of Daisy, had fallen into a coma after a tragic attempt to protect the child from an unknown assailant. The danger that threatened Michael's household was no longer theoretical, it was real, tangible, and escalating, and Sonny knew better than anyone that when enemies couldn't get to him directly, they would always target the ones he loved. It began with small things, little signs that Sonny's instincts immediately flagged. A car parked for hours outside Michael's building, its engine cold but windshield fogged from breath. A man in a hoodie, loitering too long at the cafe across the street, pretending to scroll on his phone while keeping his eyes fixed on the Corinthos apartment window. A maintenance request entered under a false name, one that Sonny's network couldn't find any employee records for. Sonny had tried to respect Michael's autonomy, had held back from interfering in the life his son was trying to build with Daisy while Sasha was unconscious. But respect quickly gave way to concern, and concern hardened into resolve when Sonny, concealed in the shadows outside Michael's apartment one night, caught sight of a dark figure lingering by the building's emergency exit. The man didn't enter. He didn't knock. He simply watched. And for Sonny, that was enough to ignite a fury he had kept buried for too long. Sonny wasn't just watching out of habit, he had reason to suspect this was tied to something deeper, darker, and more orchestrated. Jen Sidwell's recent actions, especially the death of Natalia, which was now being blamed on Sonny himself, confirmed that powerful enemies were not only hunting him but were willing to destroy his family to achieve it. If Sidwell had orchestrated Natalia's murder and framed Sonny, then there was no telling what other traps he had set in motion, and Michael, through proximity alone, was now a prime target. And Michael didn't even know it. The wedge between father and son, once born from pride and principle, had grown so wide that even danger couldn't close it, unless Sonny forced it to. Desperate to protect his son, Sonny made the decision to initiate contact under the pretense of reconciliation. He arranged a meeting with Michael at the Metro Court, presenting it as a heartfelt attempt to mend the broken pieces of their relationship. Michael arrived, guarded, skeptical, unwilling to believe that Sonny's intentions were purely familial. But Sonny, with a heavy heart and tired eyes, laid the cards on the table, everything he knew about Sidwell, everything he suspected about the figure stalking outside Michael's building, and most importantly, his fear that the attack on Sasha had not been random. It had been deliberate, precise, designed to destabilize the family. Michael, initially resistant, found himself unable to dismiss Sonny's logic. The pieces were aligning too neatly: Sasha's coma, the custody chaos around Daisy, the legal manipulation Drew and Willow were unleashing, and now this unknown predator watching from the dark. What Sonny didn't know, what made this more volatile, was that Michael had already begun digging into Sasha's attack on his own. What he had uncovered disturbed him. Security footage missing from the building the night Sasha was ambushed, phone records that suggested someone had contacted Sasha just minutes before she exited the building alone. And most chillingly, a sealed court document that linked Drew to a custody adjustment filing he had never discussed with Michael. The betrayal wasn't just external. It was bleeding from within his own circle. And now, as Sonny warned Michael of threats from the outside, Michael realized the enemy was far closer than either of them could have predicted. As father and son found themselves pulled together by circumstance rather than forgiveness, Sonny's concern deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man he saw lurking in the dark wasn't working alone, that this was a coordinated effort, one with legal and psychological implications as much as physical danger. And his instincts turned out to be correct. The figure outside Michael's building was soon identified by Brick as an operative connected to a shell company that had once been funded by Sidwell's international business fronts. But what Brick also discovered turned the entire scenario on its head. The operative wasn't just watching Michael. He was also surveilling Drew. This revelation shifted everything. If Sidwell was manipulating Drew behind the scenes, either through blackmail, bribery, or shared interests, then the custody battle over Daisy, Sasha's downfall, and even the betrayal of Willow were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a larger strategy, one aimed at dismantling Sonny's power. Not just in the streets of Port Charles but inside his own family. Michael, who had distanced himself to preserve his moral compass, was now being dragged into a war he never saw coming. And it was Sonny, ironically the very man he had fought to escape, who now stood as his last line of defense. Together, albeit reluctantly, Sonny and Michael began to reconstruct the timeline. They traced back every strange interaction, every unexplained document, every legal loophole Drew had exploited since Sasha's hospitalization. They began comparing notes on Willow, whose erratic behavior had shifted after a series of closed-door meetings with Martin Gray and a shadowy advisor neither Michael nor Sonny could identify. And they realized something terrifying. Sasha had likely discovered the conspiracy. She had been trying to tell Michael something in the days before the attack, something about Willow's role in falsifying hospital records. Something about Daisy's birth that didn't line up. And now Sasha lay in a coma, silenced before she could expose the truth. As Sonny pushed deeper into Sidwell's network, he began to realize the attack on Natalia had been a rehearsal, a test to see how far public perception could be manipulated, how easily Sonny could be blamed. And the same playbook was now being used on Sasha. But this time, Sonny was ready. With Jason at his side, fresh out of a WSB interrogation and more committed than ever to restoring order in the family, they began dismantling the web Sidwell had spun. Quietly. Efficiently. Without alerting the enemy that they knew the war had already begun. But even as Sonny and Michael prepared for the next phase of battle, the emotional scars between them remained. Forgiveness had not yet come, but urgency had made them allies. And in that fragile alliance, both men found something they had forgotten, a shared love for Sasha, for Daisy, for their fractured family, and for a version of Port Charles that didn't end in betrayal, blood, or manipulation. Yet, as Sonny watched from the shadows outside Michael's building one last time, now flanked by Jason and an entire security team, he knew the figure he had seen before would return. And this time, when he did, Sonny wouldn't just be watching. He'd be ready to strike. Because whatever came next, be it legal warfare, psychological destruction, or physical assault, one thing was now certain. Sonny Corinthos was no longer defending just a territory or an empire. He was defending the soul of his family. And this time, he would not lose. Sonny had always lived in the shadows, his world shaped by silent whisperings, long-standing grudges, and loyalties that ran deep into the dark corners of Port Charles. But nothing prepared him for the reality of seeing Jen Sidwell standing outside General Hospital's ICU in the dead of night, fixated on the entrance where Sasha lay recovering from a brutal attack. Under the dim hospital lights, Sidwell's silhouette was unmistakably intentional. He looked like a predator studying its next victim. And when Sonny watched from down the street, hidden in his car's darkened interior, his breath caught not from surprise, but from the deep, cold certainty of a threat he could no longer ignore. Sonny's instincts have always served him well. He recognized that Sidwell's mere presence outside the hospital wasn't an act of desperation, it was an act of ownership. Sidwell wasn't there by mistake or curiosity. He was there to check the pulse of his plan. A man capable of murdering Natalia and strategically framing Sonny for it wouldn't come this close by accident. And standing over the site of Sasha's recovery amplified the danger tenfold. Was Sidwell waiting for Sasha to wake and finally expose the lies he'd buried? Or was he planning to complete her work with finality? Either way, the message was clear: no one connected to Sonny, Sasha, or Daisy was safe. Panic didn't drive Sonny to act, the fire of vengeance did. The presence of this hunter just out of reach ignited a long-dormant resolve. For the first time in years, Sonny wasn't conserving his strength or choosing restraint, he was preparing for war. Quietly, he slipped out of his car and summoned Jason Morgan and Brick to the scene. Furtive phone calls were made. Information began streaming in about Sidwell's recent comings and goings, meetings with Marco Rios he thought were discreet. Anonymous wire transfers through offshore accounts, and military-grade surveillance equipment found in a nondescript unmarked van parked too many nights in a row near the hospital. Patterns were emerging, and every one led back to Sidwell. But what Sonny couldn't shake was what this moment represented. Sidwell knew the boundaries he respected were now hopelessly crossed. Sidwell didn't just target Sonny, he targeted Sonny's world, his comatose ex-wife, his traumatized daughter, his broken son. It wasn't merely a warning, it was a direct attack on the Corinthos lineage. And the repercussions were setting in motion a chain reaction so volatile that it couldn't be undone. Sonny and Jason went to work. Every ounce of their network was mobilized. Julian's contacts in the dockyards were asked to track stolen shipments. Felicia had her private investigators dig through port manifests, hoping to find links to Sidwell's international funding sources. Elizabeth and Finn provided intel on unauthorized medical personnel seen near Sasha. Even Valentine was roped in to quietly query his old connections about any whispers of psychological manipulation targeting hospital staff. Meanwhile, Sonny himself began confronting hospital security. Cornering them with calm intensity. "You say your cameras failed that night," he would say, voice even. "But that camera's failure fits Sidwell's pattern. So let's fix it, now." All the while, Michael, who had arrived at the hospital earlier to sit by Sasha's bedside, found himself thrust into another shadow war. Sonny didn't tell him everything at once. Instead, he gave him pieces, grainy photos handed across a table, snippets of transcribed audio from hospital call logs, a security badge that didn't belong. Michael's skepticism melted as he pieced together Sidwell's presence outside the ICU. With the vulnerability of his daughter and partner laid bare, Michael realized his focus needed to shift, from legal battles to survival strategies. No longer was he standing on procedural ground, now he stood in a battlefield strewn with the potential for death. Naturally, Michael's reaction was fear-tinted with rage. He was angry at himself for having let his guard down. Angry at Sasha for having fought so hard for redemption only to be struck down. Angry at Willow for her disappearance and at Drew for the hidden custody plots that had muddied their lives. But most of all, Michael was angry at Sidwell, for invading hospital sanctity and for sending a message that no place, no door, no bedside was beyond reach. As Sonny led Jason toward a strategic vantage outside the hospital, Michael followed with Carly, determined to track Daisy's whereabouts. The front line had shifted. Every hospital entrance, every staff member, every guest list in the emergency ward would be examined. Names run through background checks, cars cross-referenced. No detail was too small. Michael realized the psychological impact of the threat was as significant as the physical risk. Daisy's presence had become a vulnerability to the entire family. But now, thanks to Sonny's insight, it was also a weapon, a reason to rally, to close ranks, to sharpen instincts that had been dulled with grief and guilt. Yet despite the urgency, Sonny did not let emotion stand in the way of strategy. When Brick located the van idling near the hospital for the past 3 nights, and confirmed its plates had been cloned, Sonny didn't storm in. He probed quietly. He shut down the entrance they favored. He sent an undercover surveillance. A late-night meeting between the van's occupant and a known informant tipped the scales. Within hours, law enforcement and private security teams were tracking Sidwell's asset trail in 3 states, using the blankets of federal-coded warrants Sonny had improvised through anonymous intel gathering. No one knew it, but Sonny had already signaled the fight had begun. Back at the hospital, Michael, tipped off by Sonny, ensured Sasha's door was manned. Carly and Jason took shifts at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., each alert and calm under pressure. They took vantage positions. They ran parking logs, rechecked call logs. They scanned every ID badge. But despite their vigilance, the Shadow Watcher never appeared again that night. It was as if Sidwell had walked into a fortress and decided to back down, or else found what he needed. But what? That remained a terrifying question. It wasn't over. The shift system meant someone would eventually slip, a guard might fail to check an ID, or a camera might suffer a glitch. Sidwell counted on that. That's why Sonny planned for not just walls and eyes but offenses, minefields set deep in shadows, waiting for Sidwell's next move. And Michael, watching his father in Union reassert his power, found himself looking at Sonny with new eyes. Not a criminal kingpin, but a parent, a soldier, a lion awakened by the scent of blood near his pride. In that moment, something bonded, a respect forged in fear and action. This incident outside the ICU marked more than just another threat, it marked a turning point. For the Corinthos family, it was a declaration. There is no sanctuary. And they will defend every shard of their lives with intelligence, with cunning, and with joint resolve. Sonny may have seen Sidwell standing in the night, but what Sidwell also saw was the resurgence of the warrior he underestimated, a man who would not stand down, not when his son, his daughter, and his legacy were on the line. And Port Charles would never be the same. Sidwell had always operated in shadows, carefully plotting his next move with precision only matched by his cold detachment. But something had shifted in Port Charles, something dark, calculated, and personal. The death of Natalia Ramirez was not merely a casualty of misfortune or the cost of proximity to dangerous men. No. It was a message, clear, chilling, and utterly intentional. For Sidwell, Natalia was not just a woman from his past. She was unfinished business, a symbol of betrayal and leverage. Someone whose elimination served as both revenge and strategy. And Marco, once dismissed as collateral damage in Natalia's emotionally fraught life, was no longer a pawn. He had become Sidwell's confidant, silent partner, and possibly, the final key to a pending Port Charles itself. Together, Sidwell and Marco formed an alliance rooted not only in pain but in retribution. Marco's rejection by Natalia, exacerbated by her dismissal of his identity and loyalty, left a wound that Sidwell had exploited expertly. Where once Marco had hesitated, conflicted by the lines between justice and vengeance, Sidwell offered clarity, retribution, precision, and power. Marco didn't need to speak. His silence was enough. His presence in Sidwell's orbit confirmed his compliance, and when Natalia's body was found, lifeless and robbed of the chance at redemption, it became clear that Marco's complicity was not accidental. But the consequences of their actions didn't end with Natalia's death. They had set in motion a series of events that would soon spiral out of their control, because Sasha Gilmore Corbin and Michael Corinthos were no strangers to trauma. They had both tasted grief, betrayal, and the kind of devastation that could crumble a weaker soul. But they were still standing. And now, they were about to be tested like never before. For Sasha, the murder of Natalia was more than a tragedy. It was a warning. She had already sensed the eyes watching her, felt the tension in the air each time she walked outside with Daisy. A woman who had fought tooth and nail to reclaim her sanity and her daughter's future could sense when danger was breathing down her neck. And now, as Daisy's cries echoed in their home at night, Sasha knew something terrible was unfolding. She could feel it in her bones. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were people. They were threats. Michael, too, could feel it. As Sonny stood on the edge of his world, locked in a power struggle with Sidwell, Michael was beginning to understand that he could no longer remain on the sidelines. He had offered Sasha space, agreed to her terms for Daisy's custody, and honored her journey. But now, that peace was dissolving. If Sasha was in danger, if Daisy was being watched, Michael would no longer wait for consent. He would protect his family, no matter what it cost. When Sonny discovered that Sidwell had been stalking Sasha from a distance, lurking near Michael's building, surveilling from shadows like a hunter preparing for his strike, it confirmed every unspoken fear. This wasn't a game. It was a war. And Sidwell was willing to destroy anyone, even Sasha, To eliminate witnesses and tighten his grip on Port Charles. For Sonny, the line had been crossed. This was no longer about territory or influence. It was about family. About survival. And while Sonny prepared for a counterattack, Michael and Jason began moving in the background. They coordinated without words. Brothers in arms in a quiet battle against the storm looming over their lives. Michael called in favors. Jason followed trails. And Sasha, for her part, took no chances, locking every door. Watching every street corner, and refusing to be another woman turned into collateral damage by men playing gods. But inside Sasha, something darker was stirring. Fear had evolved into fury. The idea of losing Daisy was unbearable, and as she lay awake at night, she knew she would go to the ends of the earth to protect her child. Even if it meant confronting Sidwell herself. Even if it meant sacrificing everything. And yet, the deeper question remained, how far had Sidwell truly gone? Was Natalia his only victim, or merely the first? His movements suggested a man with a master plan. His connection with Marco was more than emotional, it was tactical. Marco had access, information. And the ability to infiltrate spaces Sidwell could not. And now, with Natalia gone and Sasha targeted, it was only a matter of time before Marco made his next move. Perhaps he would attempt to get close to Sasha under the guise of comfort, or maybe he would manipulate Daisy's vulnerability, using her as leverage. Either way, Marco was no longer the silent background character. He was a player. And he was dangerous. The weight of it all was beginning to crush Michael. As he stood in Daisy's nursery, watching her sleep beneath the gentle glow of a nightlight, he felt the walls closing in. His family had already suffered too many losses, Morgan, Kiki, Lulu. He would not lose Daisy. He would not lose Sasha. But to protect them, he might have to become someone he promised he'd never be again. Someone like Sonny. And that was the true cost of Sidwell's war. Not just lives. But identities. Morality. Peace. Michael, once the golden boy of Port Charles, was being pulled into a place where justice and revenge blurred. Sasha, the woman who had clawed her way out of a mental health crisis, was on the edge of another. Jason, whose loyalties always ran deep, was prepared to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to Michael or the child. All while Sidwell and Marco watched from their tower of deceit, believing they were 5 moves ahead. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't plan for, was that this time, the people they tried to break were already hardened by fire. This time, the pain wouldn't destroy them. It would unite them. And in that unity, in that raw and painful alliance between Sasha's trauma, Michael's rage, Jason's precision, and Sonny's wrath, a reckoning was coming. Not just for Sidwell. Not just for Marco. But for every lie, every manipulation, and every life they tried to erase. Sasha had endured too much to be silenced now. Michael had sacrificed too much to step aside. And Sonny had built too much to let it all burn at the hands of one madman. So when the storm finally breaks, and it will, Sidwell won't just face justice. He'll face the full, brutal weight of a family that refuses to lose one more soul to darkness. And in that moment, as the truth erupts and the facade shatters, the question won't be whether Sasha and Michael survive. It will be whether Sidwell and Marco can survive them.